At this time, I will turn it over to Allie to do the introduction.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to our event tonight. My name's Allie. I'm a volunteer with Climate Classes. Can we just start, with a show of Zoom hands for who lives in DC? So I think it is the majority of our attendees. So as most of us know, DC's lack of autonomy has been more visible than ever recently with ICE raids and the presence of an armed National Guard. I mean, I saw 3 rifles leaving work tonight on my way home. So at the same time that this is going on, it's really evident that there's not will or motivation to address climate change in the federal government. So the extent to which DC can adapt to and mitigate climate change is in large part dependent on DC's home rule status being upheld. And Diana, would you mind showing the slides? Because we have a number of experts who are going to engage in a panel discussion about the intersection of home rule and climate. And I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves. And we do have a slide that might show up at some point, showing our panelists' pictures and affiliations. But I will suggest at this point, I'll turn it over to Annette, and then maybe we can do Jamoni and Vanessa to introduce themselves. So Annette, please tell us about your background.
Hi, welcome everybody. My background is a former field biologist turned into environmental scientist, working for the federal government and some nonprofits for 20 years in DC. And then I had just learned so much about climate change that I quit my excellent job, which I loved, and formed 2 nonprofits, actually 3 nonprofits. And the first one, one that the logo is for Climate Steps, which is all about how individuals can make an impact on climate change. There's Earth Hero, the app, and then the DC Tool Library. I co-founded that, and I'll talk a little bit about those along the way. But basically, my focus now is climate action science. And right now I'm in Texas, actually, where it can get very brutally hot. So, but also it can in DC. So we'll talk more about that. Ready to move on to?
And Jamoni,
Yeah.
to you.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Such a pleasure to be able to convene and have this really important discussion about the intersection of home rule and climate. I am Jamoni Overby, and I serve as the DC Conservation Advocate with Nature Forward. Nature Forward inspires residents of the greater Washington, D.C. region to appreciate, understand, and protect their natural environment through outdoor experiences, education, and advocacy. And I come in as the advocate, and I really focus on different intersectional justice issues that relate to the environment, such as home rule, housing, energy, and food security, and all of these things that really intersect with everyday lives of Washingtonians. I myself am a 5th generation Washingtonian, so it's really special and near and dear to my heart, this work, and really excited to be able to share this panel with everybody this evening and hear from other residents and people from other jurisdictions that are really concerned and have the ability to kind of labor on with us in DC. So thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. I am Vanessa Batters-Thompson. I am the executive director of a nonprofit based in DC called the DC Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. DC Appleseed's mission is simple. Our goal is to make the DC area better. And we use a variety of different tools to improve the DC metro area. We use research, we use advocacy, and we do use the law through litigation. So we have a wide mandate, but our projects all focus on three core areas, which are really mutually reinforcing. We focus on DC democracy, which includes the Home Rule Act, which is a big part actually of what we're going to talk about today. We also focus on economic mobility and racial equity. And our climate work comes out of that equity component of our work, in part because in DC, the history of polluted areas, the history of how our natural environment has been taken care of is so inextricably intertwined with the history of race in DC. So we bring kind of a different lens to our work. I am a lawyer and a policy person by background. So we have a broad cross section of different educational backgrounds here today, but like Jamoni, I count myself as an advocate. So it's great to be here. Thank you for hosting it. And a special welcome to those of you from other jurisdictions, in part because DC does not have voting representation, which we'll talk about a little bit in my overview of Home Rule. It's really important that folks from other states support DC's work on democracy and climate issues. So thank you for being here.
And thank you to our wonderful panelists. It's going to be a fabulous discussion tonight. I do just want to say that the fourth panelist, Ms. Brenda, is unable to join us tonight, but in her absence, I do just want to say on her behalf, she's an incredible advocate for Ward 7 and 8 residents and a huge thinker in the environmental justice space. So if you do have the pleasure of attending a talk with her and are able to do so, I highly, highly recommend it. I'm going to turn it over to Allie now to give an overview of what the DC government has currently been able to do in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so before we launch into the panel, we wanted to give a background on what the government's doing in the climate space and also a background on the Home Rule Act. So I want to talk a little bit about what our local government has done in the climate space, which is a lot. So I just want to say that this is not comprehensive by any means. I just wanted to illustrate some of the things that DC has done. So DC has limited power to pass legislation, and it's limited because, and Vanessa will correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that Congress has to review legislation, and that's the final step. But DC has passed legislation on climate commitment as well as on clean energy. So important to know that some legislation has been passed. Now, when we speak about climate action, broadly, we split it into two categories. One is adaptation, which means taking action to adapt to the impacts of climate change or to prepare for the impacts of climate change on people, homes, communities, businesses, infrastructure. And then the other category is mitigation, which is addressing the root causes of climate change, like reducing emissions from greenhouse gases. So I'll give some examples in both of those categories. The first one is that DC has a plan to adapt to a changing climate. That plan is called Climate Ready DC. The next thing is that the district has an extreme heat adaptation strategy, which is called Keep Cool DC. So extreme heat is the leading cause of climate-related deaths nationwide. And summer temperatures, as Annette will probably mention, are projected to continue increasing in the years to come. So it's really critical for the district to expand strategies that protect its residents from extreme heat. The next one that I've listed is community resilience hubs, which are in pilot stage, but are and will be facilities that provide information and services to build resilient communities before, during, and after emergency events. And the final example is the flood risk tool, which the district developed to help design professionals and developers identify the potential flood impacts of a particular site. So that's really important as we face changing precipitation patterns, rising sea levels, but again, just a kind of random selection to give examples of what the district has done in the adaptation space. So turning over to mitigation, the district is committed to becoming carbon neutral and climate resilient by 2045 and achieving neutrality in its own operations by 2040.
I've got 11.
I missed that. I'll keep going. The next example is the Clean Energy DC plan, which is really a roadmap to achieve the goal of reducing greenhouse gases 60% by 2030, and lays out the actions that need to be taken in our buildings and energy infrastructure and transportation to achieve that. The final bullet I've listed is annual inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. And in case you were wondering, emissions have been decreasing since 2006. So it's really important that the district is keeping track of those, because in order to reduce them, we need to know what the baseline is. The last thing I put on here is a really important catalyst for change in the district, which is the Commission on Climate Change and Resiliency. So it was established 9 years ago. It provides independent perspective from 16 experts on DC's adaptation and mitigation activities, and recommends priorities to the city council and the mayor's office. So again, just a selection, but I hope it paints a picture of the fact that DC is and has been doing quite a lot in the climate space. And I will now turn it over to Vanessa to teach us all about Home Rule.
Great. Well, I am so thrilled to be here to talk to you about Home Rule, because it really does have a close relationship to climate work in the district, particularly climate work done by our government. I find that a lot of people understand that DC as an entity is not quite like a state, but they don't necessarily understand the ins and the outs of the DC governmental structure. I'm going to give you a brief, non-exhaustive overview of DC and how the status of Home Rule relates to our climate work. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want you to understand is the current structure of DC has by no means been the structure throughout the cycle of our country's life. Over the period between 1787 and today, we've had a number of different structures. But one of the constant features has been a tension between the control of Congress over a federal district, which is provided by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution, and the fact that DC itself is quite a large population. Today, it's over 700,000 people, which means we're larger than 2 US states. There's this tension between, the capital of the free world and this group of citizens who live in the district and what their rights look like. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the Home Rule Act. So the Home Rule Act purpose is here. But in short, the goal of the Home Rule Act, when it was passed by Congress, was to effectively relieve Congress of the burden of the day-to-day management of a huge metropolis. There were also considerations about racial equity and civil rights of the DC residents, and there was a lot of tension actually around racial issues and what would happen if Congress gave DC, which at that time was the largest majority minority city in the country, governance of themselves. Next slide, please. What we ended up with in DC with the Home Rule Act is a compromise, and it's very imperfect. One thing I always tell people is it really should be the limited Home Rule Act, because Congress gave DC some basic rights to govern itself, but it very much held on to the control to limit DC from doing things that they don't agree with. So the first thing you should know is that the Home Rule Act does give DC the right to elect a mayor to administer the city. In addition to the right to elect a mayor, it gave the mayor the right to set up basically our administrative state, our agencies for the DC government. And this is relevant to our conversation today, excuse me, because the Department of Energy and Environment, which does most of the environmental work in DC, is one of those entities that was formed under the Home Rule Act. The Home Rule Act also gives us the right to elect a maximum of 13 council members to legislate. And in DC, the council does frequently pass legislation related to environmental issues. So this is an important aspect of Home Rule for concepts related to climate and environmental law. However, while we have the right to elect a mayor and we have the right to elect a DC council, and later we amended the Home Rule Act to also include the right to elect our attorney general, Congress retained explicit authority to legislate on DC's local affairs. And that looks like a couple different things. So first, Congress can always overrule a law passed by DC. There's something called the congressional review period. It is usually 30 days for environmental legislation, but it can be 60 days for anything related to our criminal code or criminal procedure. Up until recently, it was fairly rare for a disapproval resolution in Congress to pass both houses and then be signed by the President of the United States, which is what's required for Congress to disapprove of a DC law. However, since 2023, we've been seeing it happen much more frequently. So it is out there, and certainly the threat of disapproval chills some conversations around environmental law, particularly when there's a more conservative Congress and a more conservative president in office. The other thing that the Home Rule Act does is it prohibits the council from enacting laws in certain areas. Some of these seem like they don't really relate to environmental law. However, it's important to know that what these provisions do is limit DC from taking revenues or benefiting from revenue streams that the states usually benefit from. For example, commuter taxes. DC is not permitted to tax DC residents or, DC cannot tax folks that work in DC but live in Maryland and Virginia. And that's different, right, from a tri-state area like New York City, with people commuting in from New Jersey and Connecticut. How this relates to environmental law is it reduces the revenues available to enact solutions that require revenue to enact. Next slide, please. The other thing that the Home Rule does is it provides Congress substantial authority over the district's budget. And many people didn't really understand what this meant or how much this could mean until this March, when Congress prohibited DC from spending about $1.1 billion of its own locally elected tax funds with a continuing resolution in Congress. Over time, the process for budget approval by Congress for DC has changed a little bit. There was a law passed called the Local Budget Autonomy Amendment Act, which changed the type of review from an active passage to a passive review. However, as we saw this year, it is a little unclear where Congress and the DC government disagree about expenditures, how that local budget autonomy act really plays in. Congress also exerts control over DC through the federal appropriations process, separate from just our budget. It is really common for the federal budget passed each year to prohibit specific expenditures by the DC government. The classic example I like to give is cannabis in DC. So DC decriminalized cannabis back in 2013 with the intention of legalizing and taxing it. However, every year since 2013, a Maryland Congressman, Andy Harris, has included a budget rider on the federal budget, which prevents DC from expending any funds to tax or regulate cannabis. That means what we've ended up with is a gray market, and we can't benefit from the tax revenues that other jurisdictions benefit from when they legalize cannabis. This year, there is a rider, or there's two riders actually on the appropriations bill right now. They could still be pulled off, but there are two that specifically relate to climate and environmental issues. One is a prohibition on DC using any local funds to enforce a rule relating to the adoption of California vehicle emission standards. And the other one limits DC's ability to enforce provisions of the Consumer Protection Act against oil and gas companies for environmental claims. So we can see how Congress's effect over DC, or Congress's control over DC, can be used to limit environmental actions. Next slide. All right, there's some resources there about home rule. I think one thing that I want to convey that people don't necessarily understand is that if DC was to have home rule taken away from it in its entirety, there would be no government framework to pass laws or to enforce laws or engage in rulemaking for any of the environmental legislation that Ali mentioned in her overview. So these issues are inextricably related at multiple levels of, when you look at the Home Rule Act in multiple ways, whether it's used as a threat to stop more environmentally friendly legislation from being passed, whether DC is limited on enforcing regulatory rulemaking, or whether it's something as drastic as the end of home rule and the end of the DC government structure as we know it. There are a variety of different ways at varying levels of acuity in which the federal government can limit DC's ability to enact the types of environmental laws that our residents tend to support. Thank you. Turning it back to you, Ali.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that incredible overview. We did just have the resources slide up, and we will share that again at the end. So if you missed the QR code, don't worry. When we're going through the Q&A, we will have that slide up. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that really detailed and comprehensive overview of home rule and how it would affect DC. Thank you so much to Ali for the very detailed overview of the DC government, the laws, and the policies that we are currently operating under. Very helpful and an excellent way to start what I'm very excited for, which will be this panel discussion. The thing about environmental discussions that I find is almost a necessary part of them is we're going to have to kind of continue to go down the road of bad news before we're going to get into kind of the resolution. And so I say that to set the table because I'm going to turn it over to Annette first with kind of an overview question. We started out talking, and Ali hinted a little bit at this in her presentation, but I think it's very important to kind of set the table for folks and really dive in, especially with your climate science background, as to what exactly would be at stake if we were to suddenly not have any of these laws, regulations, or policies and working groups that we currently have in the district.
So yeah, so climate change has a lot more impacts than many people on average think. It's, if you think about the climate of the planet is changing, everything on the planet is affected. And it's going to be in DC very problematic for those who work outside and for the young and the elderly especially. So it's not just environmental regulations that could be impactful, but care of youth, care of the elderly, etc. So those are considerations that we have to have. But the first impact that everybody thinks about since climate change started really being mentioned is sea level rise. And as many people know, the Potomac and the Anacostia are tidal rivers, and they will rise. As will probably be talked about, it will severely affect Ward 7, where there are already 492 residential buildings that are susceptible to 100-year flooding, and Ward 8 also. And so some of the places that will be affected, especially are Buzzard Point, Kenilworth Park, Watts Branch, and Oxen Run. But also definitely the metro will be affected, especially near the mall. But there are great maps that have already been constructed, and Allie presented some of the resources. So I'm going to turn more to one that a lot of people don't realize is already happening in DC and is going to become extreme, and that's extreme heat. And so when I moved to DC in 1994, there were 4 days a year of 95+ degree weather. It's tripled since then. They're not almost tripled. It's about 11 days a year of 95+ degree weather. By 2040, it's going to hit around 30 days a year of 95+ degree weather. And that's going to triple by 2100. So almost triple. So what we're already, DC suffers from, I have the numbers here. DC has gone from 11 days a year of emergency heat days. Right now, that's what we have. And then by 2050, it's predicted to have 18 to 20 days a year of emergency heat. By 2050, it will get to 30 to 40 days a year. So it has gone from 11, it's now 18 to 20 days a year. And by 2050, it's going to get to 30 to 40 days a year of emergency heat. And as we all know, DC is not equitable in terms of shade, and the urban heat island effect is very intense in DC. So some of the impacts that this will have is on construction workers, on the elderly and the young, as I mentioned, delivery, but it also means more humidity, which holds more pollution. There will be warmer summer nights, so people without AC won't be able to cool off at night, which is very stressful for health. But there's also the direct correlation of heat and violence and crime, which is definitely, something we'll need to plan for. But in another way, it's also correlated that students in schools without AC score lower on tests. So these are impacts that we as a city need to think about. Other direct impacts of extreme heat include damage to power stations, damage to rails with rails buckling, and damage to roadways with asphalt. Hot asphalt under trucks becomes more putty-like, but plus they emit fumes. The hotter the day, we can smell the roads, on hot days, and that's very health impacting. Then there's the general area, the general region that's affected. If you think of the agricultural farms around us that supply food through, grocery stores and farmers markets, they're going to have to shift northward in terms of the crops, which causes food insecurity. There'll be droughts and wildfires in our region, stress on native species. There's also going to be invasive species with the mosquitoes that carry malaria and more West Nile virus and Chagas disease, which is the kissing bug that does that. Also, there are refugees who are going to be coming our way. So in 2021, there was a massive drought in Guatemala that was directly linked to climate change, and it led to a mass migration of many people into legally and illegally into the US. And this is something we're going to need to think about: food and housing, water and jobs. Later, as DC gets really hot, there's also the consideration. There have been models determined for this, how a lot of the population of the US is going to move northwards, and people who can afford to move can move, but those who cannot will be left behind with fewer resources. So obviously, this is of extreme importance to the city. And Allie did great. I already had some of those same programs that DC has come up with. DC has been great. The city council has been mostly leaning towards climate initiatives, but there are also great efforts community-wise, like the climate resilience hubs that this man named Dennis Williams, if I got the last name right, pretty much started himself in Ward 8. And it includes the Youth Climate Corps being trained to handle climate emergencies. And then there's all sorts of individual initiatives, and there are ways to tap into serving on panels within some of these initiatives. So I would definitely keep in touch with your city council members and your ANC members. So
thank you so much, Annette. And actually, you're even starting to get ahead, because we're going to talk even more about resources. But yeah. I do appreciate you uplifting some things, because a lot of what you shared is definitely very dismal. I want to really bring in the work of the organizations of Vanessa and Jamoni. But before we do that, and before they kind of get into the work that they're doing, I wanted to open this up, even after that really fantastic overview from Annette, if there are specific climate change issues that you, Vanessa, and you, Jamoni, are really thinking about and really looking at in your organizations. And then I'd like to talk about the work that you all are doing to get into the weeds on that. So I'll turn it over to Jamoni first, and then Vanessa.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. We're focusing on quite a lot of issues, I would say, in DC. As I mentioned before, really what's been the focus is like how a lot of these environmental issues impact residents. And in the intersection, we're looking at housing, we're looking at how not only like the conditions of housing, but also gas emissions that are coming within your homes through some of the work that we're doing. We're also focusing on extreme heat in some ways. We're also really focused on the different ways in which water is being impacted, and how the waterways of DC have really been impacted due to this most recent budget cycle, and how we're going to continue to be able to advocate for better water quality, as we have all been working for us fishable and swimmable Anacostia for many, many years. Electrification is kind of tied into that energy conversation that we're having. Of course, we also talk about solar. We also talk about the impact of flooding and that happening a lot more frequently with residents in DC, and how they can, make themselves less susceptible to flooding, how they can handle it, and what resilience really looks like for a lot of our frontline communities. I wonder if I'm probably missing a bunch of things, but those are just like a few of the examples of what has really been the focus of Nature Forward, doing this work. And whenever the beauty of these partnerships with many organizations is we're not all experts in every one of these areas. So we're able to lean on each other and help advocate for ultimately a better environmental landscape in DC, not only for the waterways and for the green spaces, but for the people that live there. Sometimes people often forget that DC is home to over 700,000 people. So although a lot of times people come to visit and it's a very attractive touristy area, we also want to make sure that the residents are also being able to be taken care of through environmental justice practices, through, oh, I forgot, lead in water is also another big situation, and that water quality of what people are also drinking. So I'll let Vanessa take on anything I may have missed with the many issues in DC, but we try to keep our footprint a little bit in each of these because it requires all of us.
Great, thank you, Jamoni. So DC Appleseed approaches these issues from a framework of law and policy, and that often means that we're deeply focused on the government's role in addressing climate change versus the science of climate change itself. And so, like Jamoni's organization, we have often looked at this issue from the perspective of the community, and specifically the disparities faced by our Black and Brown residents versus the white residents in DC. In DC, you can look at a heat map of virtually any medical condition, and unfortunately, it's almost always going to look the same, right? Whether you're talking about high blood pressure, whether you're talking about maternal mortality, infant mortality, unfortunately, most chronic health conditions are disproportionately represented in wards 7 and 8 east of the Anacostia River, and to a lesser degree, Ward 5, which is sort of the far east of the city, but north of the Anacostia River. We've been involved in the restoration of the Anacostia River for over 20 years now. Our organization worked with the multiple governments involved in restoring the Anacostia River and helped create the path that the river cleanup has followed, including the Anacostia River Sediment Project, which is one of the biggest environmental projects that DC will be taking on in the next few years related to mitigation of long-term pollution in the Anacostia River. Recently in 2024, we added climate change to our projects, and it is a sub-project under a larger health equity project in DC. And the goal of our health equity project is to use law and policy to address the poor health outcomes that I mentioned before and the long-standing disparities in DC. And we frankly saw climate as one of the areas where those disparities were likely to grow. And it is true that already climate change issues in DC disproportionately impact our Black and Brown and our lower income residents. Like Jamoni, we are very, very focused on extreme heat. Extreme heat is an issue where DC is somewhat underperforming in its governmental response. And what I mean by that is in 2024, there is a dashboard called the EMSIS dashboard, the Emergency Medical Services Information System dashboard, that shows how many ambulances are deployed on extreme heat days by 100,000 residents. And in 2024, DC was deploying ambulances on extreme heat days at a much higher rate than jurisdictions that by temperature alone should have a higher rate of deployment. So for example, DC was deploying more emergency medical services vehicles than places in Arizona, places in Florida. And to us, that really suggested, hey, there's a policy failure here, right? These other jurisdictions have found policy solutions to these issues, even if it's whether it's mitigation or adaptation, they have found a way to manage higher temperatures better than we have in DC. So in recent years, we've been pushing really hard for DC's Department of Health to take a more active role in climate work here in DC. In addition to high heat days, we also have been involved in lead pipes, fixing lead in the drinking water here in DC. And one area that we have talked about over and over again that is related to extreme heat, but also slightly different, is actually asthma. DC has extremely high rates of asthma, and very often housing conditions and extreme heat play a role with each other, as well as DC does not require air conditioning in rental properties. And that has all exacerbated that issue for many, many, many children and families in DC. So those are the areas that we really look at this from. We also are engaged from a government oversight as well as a budget oversight role. Those are two of the core mechanisms we use to ensure that the Department of Energy and Environment here in DC has adequate resources to fulfill the role that DC residents by and large want to see them fill.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was a fabulous overview, and I'm so grateful that you started to get into that kind of like policy intersection and how DC Appleseed is filling that in. Jamoni, I actually want to go back to you because I think you brought something up that was a really key and an excellent word to bring into this, and that's partnerships. And so by way of an overview, the DC Department of Energy and Environment, or DOEE, funded Nature Forward to spread awareness of flood issues in Ward 7 and 8. And I know that's not all you all are focused on and working to fix. But this program connects residents to district programs that promote flood mitigation and resilience. And I'd really like to hear a little bit more about how you created partnerships to do this and why it's important, given all of these climate impacts that we have discussed so far that the district is facing. And then just to tie it a little bit back to home rule and what we've also been discussing, what would these, what would diminishing local control and also potentially diminishing partnerships mean ultimately for your work?
This is like I'm just going to try and keep it brief because I know we have like a minimum time, but so this project is really, I think it's very special because of the culmination of partnerships that we've been able to bring into the work. I'm going to highlight Washington Interfaith Network as well as the Green Scheme and Ward 7 Resilience Hub Community Coalition as some of our core partners for the flooding work that we were doing last year in DC. And we're going to be able to continue this work as well. And as I mentioned before, the work requires all of us, and all of our organizations have different skill sets and capacities to help improve this work. And honestly, I would not be able to do it by myself. So as Annette mentioned, Ward 7 has a very high number of homes that are impacted and that are located in the 100 and 500-year floodplains due to its proximity to Watts Branch, which is a tributary to the Anacostia River. And because of that, not only have residents been experiencing flooding, for decades, but also now that's happening a lot more frequently. And this is a major cost on people's homes, their ability to, pass on generational wealth, or, be able to upgrade their homes in different ways, because they have to deal with all of the things that come with molds and the things that impact your actual day-to-day life when you have experienced a flood. And so we saw that it was very important that we highlight this and um, bring in a organization that was already doing the work, who probably needed a little bit more like capacity to continue to reach more people, and also expand it and to reach Ward 8 and how they're also being impacted. So Ward 7 Resilience Hub Community Coalition has a partnership with the Francois Center, located in Ward 7 on Annie Helen Burroughs Avenue. And historically, just that is an area that floods a lot, and that is partly due to the when 295 was built. So all of these systemic areas, when 295 was built, it split a community in half. Not only did it split it in half, but it also forces community to deal with a lot of flooding that persists to today. So Ward 7 Resilience Hub Community Coalition had this this footprint in the community because they're an organization that is built with actual community members. And we bought them, we kind of bought each other into the fold and saying, how can we continue to do this work and helps make sure people are informed about flooding, why it's happening. It's not just something that happens, but also empower them to have the knowledge and to have the in-depth understanding of the climate issue of flooding, why it's happening, and what they can actually do about it, not only in their homes, but as it relates to advocating for themselves and for their communities. Washington Interfaith Network has an amazing outreach strategy and a lot of volunteers. They also work on Black equity through home ownership, as well as electrification work. And that's just to list a few things, but they were able to help us spread the word around the city by providing scouting, or I would say canvassing. So really that in-person knock on somebody's door and sharing information, it's communal, and that is the love of what DC really embodies, is that community aspect. So they were able to bring that into the fold. And then the green scheme was also very special in this project because we also need youth. The green scheme is actually focusing on urban agriculture, but we did a partnership with them on a project called Ward 8 Water Watchers, which is now just called Ward Water Watchers because it has expanded across the different wards in DC, but really to bring meaningful watershed education into what they were already doing with students all across the city with urban agriculture. So they just brought in flooding education as another piece for students to understand that, how many students uh, have experienced a flood, and do they know what that means? And getting them really excited about climate work is really what's going to help sustain us for future generations. So that's just a little bit of like how we created this partnership and why it was important. It was a multi-generational project. And not only did we have workshops with youth and parents separately, but we also were able to bring them together in flood walks and other different interactive opportunities for people to see not only what is happening, but also what is DC doing about it and what they can do about it. And I'll share some links in the chat after I finish my spiel. But I think this is very important given the climate impacts that DC is facing, because us giving this information has also empowered and wanted people to learn a lot more, not only about flooding, but other environmental issues that are impacting their community. A lot of times frontline communities or communities of color just experience these things, and it's become a normal, and it's kind of you being in survival mode and not necessarily having the wherewithal to be able to maybe take different steps that we as advocates have the ability to. But the small things that we're able to do, like sending a letter campaign to your council members and able to say that you have the power to raise your voice and this is how you can do so, and leading them through that. Why it has been really important given the climate impact that DC is facing. We were able to call on those same residents. We reached over 900 residents over in a span of 6 months, which also just shows that this is something that people want to learn about, both virtually and in person. And being able to call on them during the budget for Department of Energy and Environment, which experienced over 25, I think a 24% reduction in its budget this year, which houses a lot of our climate programs, and calling on those residents to then take action in the ways they know best, because they know that these programs are helping their communities and they're now participating in them as well. And then moving on over into like how diminishing the local control over our budget and laws will mean for us developing partnerships. As Vanessa knows, as Annette knows, a lot of our partners are no longer receiving certain funds from Department of Energy and Environment due to those cuts. Some of the funding has been cut for programs like Flood Smart Homes. They're able to do assessments, but they're no longer able to do the retrofits in homes. So there are all these barriers that have budget-wise is the barrier that is restricting residents from really getting the help that they need to address the array of issues that are happening, even when it comes to the lead crisis. Like, these are all things that are happening in tandem with each other that DC was making progress on. And it's really, it's like us going backwards with all of these investments that have been made into the Anacostia River, ensuring that we have trash traps and water quality monitoring. Other organizations like the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay that has done water quality monitoring with community members, community science, and getting residents involved, and no longer being able to do that. So that is what is really impacting our work in that relationship that organizations have built with the community, and that the Department of Energy and Environment and DC government has built those relationships as well through organizations that are working within the frontline communities.
Thank you so much, Jamoni. That was really an incredible overview and so helpful. I realize, just looking at the time now, time flies when you're having fun, and this has been just an incredible panel. Thank you to all of you again for bringing your expertise, such a variety of expertise, and really to pulling us into this discussion. But I'm not letting you go just yet. I think that we've given folks a lot of information, and I think we've got a lot of excited people on this call who want to be able to plug in and, despite the odds, push forward to continue to progress progress these goals and to get us into a better place, even if there are other forces that are working against this. So I want to open it up to the panelists. I'll start with Annette and then pass it down. If each of you wants to give probably a somewhat brief just overview of one or two ways that folks can plug in and help to really continue the very important work that needs to be done. I'll turn it over to Annette first.
Thanks. So climate steps focus mostly on individual action, but it includes, people equate individual with personal action, but individuals can definitely plug into civic meetings and contribute to decision making, etc. And I think that's one thing that's very encouraging, that even under the radar and low key stuff and to big stuff, people can contribute. It's just extremely effective to even comment online about initiatives, because studies have been found that show commenting language, the language that people comment with, winds up often in final regulations and laws and stuff like that. But like Jamoni said, is definitely the communities have our back, the communities and individuals within the community. Individuals and community groups are the ones who actually implement the policies that are coming down from the top. If we think about the rebates for the appliances, it's up often to individuals, and we can still do that. The other thing is, initiatives like the DC Tool Library, which I mentioned earlier, can have win-win-win scenarios. It is actually a climate fighting, equity building process together. And so if we can share resources and show what's effective, especially for people in different wards, what's available in their wards, then I think that could be great. And get trained in first aid and start a neighborhood phone tree, and but also talk to your city council members and join brainstorming groups. Did that answer your question completely?
It more than answered it. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Thank you so much. Jamoni, I will turn it over to you next for ways that folks can get involved.
Yeah, of course. So many ways to get involved. I love to highlight some of the things that are actually going on coming up. That there's a hearing for a bottle bill for DC on October 1st, which means that we are holding companies and producers responsible for the trash and litter from their bottles that are being tossed in the rivers and our parks and our green spaces. And so for more information on that, I'll also drop a link in the chat and to be follow up with resources, but really encouraging people to, take action in what way they see fit, to advocate for us to help clean up the Anacostia River in that way. And it really invokes like that community, that communal aspect of, let's us cleaning up our own communities, and we get a deposit back for it too. And then I would also just like to highlight the continued advocacy for sustainable standards at RFK Stadium. This is something we didn't dive too deep into, but we also see that is another thing that is really being impacted by home rule and by budget, is just that I would say home rule and budget as it relates to us or Muriel Bowser trying to really make sure that we are abiding by what the federal government is expecting from DC. And so I want to highlight that there's still work to be done for those sustainable standards and making sure that we have better and more stricter laws as relates to those building energy performance standards, zero waste on that campus and on that site, and making sure that we're preserving as much green space as possible and protecting the Anacostia River. So those are two things I'll just highlight. And just, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly at any moment. I'd love to be able to connect with other community members or people that might be interested in shedding light on what is needed across the DMV region. We also have advocates in Maryland and Virginia, so please feel free to connect in any way possible.
Thank you so much. And Vanessa, how would you encourage people to get involved?
Yeah, so I've got one suggestion for folks in DC and one suggestion for the folks who are in a nearby jurisdiction or two. So the first one, Jamoni stole my answer, which was get involved in the bottle bill. We're facing a lot of money from some lobbying groups representing corporate interests. The hearing is literally October 1st. There is a testimony clinic tomorrow. This is your opportunity to get involved and support something that is very low cost, which is important given DC's economy, but would have a huge impact. About 80% of trash by weight that comes out of the Anacostia River are bottles. And we don't yet fully understand the consequences of all those plastic bottles leaching PFAS into the Anacostia River. But it cannot be great for everybody's health. So I encourage you not just to testify at the bottle bill hearing, but get involved, be an educated and active citizen. I don't think the average person understands how few people it takes to turn up and speak out in support of a bill to make a huge concrete difference in the DC Council. And you can always submit testimony written through the DC Council's testimony management system. You can show up in person. You can even testify online now. So it's much easier than it used to be. And there are lots of groups out there that will help you if you're uncomfortable or unfamiliar with the process. But you don't need to be an expert to show up and tell your government what you think. be an engaged citizen. Now, for residents outside of DC, I have a slightly different assignment. So if you live in Maryland or Virginia or West Virginia, you have voting representation in Congress, which DC residents do not. And one of the things we need folks to do right now is stand up and say, we do not think it is a good use of Congress's time to micromanage DC. That is a very active conversation we're having. There's about 16 pieces of legislation in the House right now that all take away rights from DC or roll back DC's laws that were passed by our locally elected government officials. It is undemocratic. But because DC does not have voting representation in Congress, we don't have a voice in that discussion. So if you live in Maryland or Virginia or West Virginia, figure out who your congressperson is, figure out who your representative in the House is or your senator, give them a call, send them an email and say you support the right of DC residents to pass the legislation that their locally elected officials write and pass and designate as priorities for our jurisdiction. Finally, I will note that if you are in Maryland, there is a companion bill to DC's bottle bill going through Maryland's legislature over the next year. The goal is to get the entire Anacostia watershed covered by bills passed in DC and Maryland. So if you're interested in the bottle bill, but you live in Maryland, get involved with folks in your community to help pass that so that we cover the watershed of the Anacostia and not just the river itself.
Thank you so much. Thank you all again for taking the time this evening, for participating in this discussion, and for educating, myself, folks on this call, and for bringing hope into this call by giving us some really awesome concrete action items. And I'm sure folks will have a very hard time picking which one or all of them they are going to choose to take forward. So thank you all so much again for your time. We really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who participated in this discussion. And I hope that you are able to carry this discussion forward. We did have a question in the chat as to whether or not this recording will be made available. It will be made available. It will actually be made available through the resources page that you can get to through the QR code, and also the page which I believe Diana dropped into the chat as well. It will just take a few days to upload. And if you are interested and want to get involved with or want to know more about events like this, please subscribe to the Climate Classes newsletter or follow us on Instagram at Climate Classes. I know we are over time, and I think we can stop the recording if we haven't already. But if our wonderful